So Exodus chapter 33, this is talking about the story of Moses with the Israelites in the wilderness. And we know that they had amazing experiences with God, and God was using Moses powerfully to do his will, to do God's will. And they came to this situation where God's people, they began to reveal that though they were out of Egypt, Egypt was not out of them. And they began to worship idols. They began to complain and desire to go back to Egypt. And in the midst of all that, we find God revealing himself to Moses in a very special way to sustain him and to, vindicate him before the people and to strengthen him to continue to guide God's people in fulfilling God's will. And we come to this very interesting text that I would like to read with you in Exodus 33 and verse 11. The Bible says here, "So the Lord spoke to Moses." Notice carefully the language now. I want to emphasize this. He spoke to Moses face to face. And then he goes on to say, "As a man speaks to his friend." And he would return to the camp, but his servant Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, did not depart from the tabernacle. So I want to highlight this relationship that Moses had with God, to speak with him face to face as to a friend. When I read this text, I can't help but to think, I wish I had the same experience that Moses had. And we're not only talking about the possibility to commune with God on a daily basis, but we are talking about even physically seeing the presence of the Lord and all that glory that was manifested, and that open conversation, as a friend. When we talk to a friend, the conversation flows. There is connection, okay, and we feel comfortable. And it's almost like, what else could you ask if you had this kind of relationship with God and connection with God? It's the kind of relationship that very few people in the world has ever had. I'm sure if we were to hear testimonies here, if I was going to open to testimonies, we would hear from all of us here supernatural experiences with God. But I would like to suggest that Moses' relationship with God and his experience of supernatural presence and power that comes from God, it was beyond that probably all of us have experienced, and maybe even together. And when I read this, again, I go back to the thought, like, what else could I ask? And yet, when you come down to verse 13, I want you to see what Moses says to God. His conversation here in verse 13, "Now, therefore, I pray." So here is Moses again in the presence of God, pleading with God. And what is he going to pray for? "I pray, if I have found grace in your sight, show me now your way." And notice carefully the sentence that follows, "that I may know you, and that I may find grace in your sight. And consider that this nation is your people." So he is pleading for more. And in fact, if you read the verses around, he wants to have the assurance of God's favor, of God's grace, of God's wisdom, of God's presence, of God's guidance, of God's power in his endeavor to fulfill God's mission, to fulfill God's will. I mean, if I had the experience that Moses had in verse 11, probably I would be very confident that God was already with me and he was going to give me wisdom and power and guidance. But Moses says, "No, I need to go deeper and make sure, Lord, that you're going to be with me. And he even says, I pray that you reveal yourself that I may know you. What? Don't you know God already? Don't you know God already? You talk to God as to a friend, face to face. Nobody has this kind of experience around you. And you're asking God to reveal himself more to you, that you may know him. So this is the kind of hunger that Moses was experienced. And as I'm saying to you, what else could you ask? But he's asking for more. And I came to the conclusion that the closer we come to God, more hungry and thirsty we feel for his presence. And that was what Moses was experiencing. You know, just sharing a little bit of my own experience with the Lord and devotional. I remember when I came to the faith, I probably didn't have a devotion. I don't remember exactly, but probably I didn't have like a daily devotional. But then as time went on and I start learning more, I start dedicating half an hour to God. And that half an hour seemed to be a long time. It seemed to be a reasonable time to dedicate to God. But you know, after some time, I realized that half an hour wasn't enough. Then I decided to dedicate 1 hour to God. And my focus is not so much in the time that I spend in my devotion, but the Lord began to increase that hunger and that need to be in his presence. And that started growing with time. And that was exactly what Moses was experiencing. And I want to come down and I want to close with verse 18. It's a famous verse. Probably some of you, or if not all of you, have read this verse or even shared it with somebody. And I know there are some preachers here or even preached about this verse. But this verse comes right in that context that Moses already spoke to God face to face and as to a friend. And he was pleading for God to reveal himself and to be present with him so that he may know God. And then he says in verse 18, and he said, please show me your glory. We know that God's glory is more than his power. It is his very person, his very character. But you see this need to ask for God to reveal himself and have the assurance of God's presence and blessing. So the lesson for me, and I would like to suggest would be a good lesson for all of us as we engage in these mission trips. We cannot afford to come to these mission trips without the assurance of God's presence. No matter how good your relationship with God is right now, we still need to continue to plead for his blessing, for his presence, for his guidance, for his wisdom, for his power, for him to reveal himself. We see in sacred history, every time that God's people decide to move on without that assurance, they fail miserably. For instance, you have Joshua conquering Jericho, but right after he loses the battle to a way smaller city that seemed to be simple. So I encourage all of us to continue to pray and plead with God for his direction and for his blessing. Well, may the Lord bless us.